In the misty streets of medieval Europe, a silent terror gripped the population. Accusations of witchcraft and sorcery could shatter lives, ruin families, and lead to horrific, inescapable punishment. These accusations weren't just the whispers of superstition. They were the power of religion, politics, and fear combined. Those accused of sorcery were cast into an unforgiving world where torture was not just a means of punishment, but a societal norm designed to extract confessions, condemn souls, and enforce a twisted sense of justice. The concept of witchcraft had deep roots in medieval culture. The Church, which wielded enormous power during the period, played a central role in defining what constituted a crime against God. Heretics, healers, and anyone with unorthodox views or mysterious abilities were often branded as witches. But how did these accusations turn into a death sentence? What methods of torture were used to extract confessions from the innocent? And why did medieval Europe descend into such savagery? Imagine walking through a town square, hearing rumors of a woman accused of bewitching the crops. The next thing you know, she's being dragged to a prison, her hands bound, her fate sealed by nothing more than the gossip of a frightened populace. Accusations of sorcery were often based on nothing more than personal vendettas, jealousy, or even fear of the unknown. For the accused, there was no escape. The early days of witch hunts. The fear of witches surged in Europe during the 15th and 16th centuries, reaching its peak during the Spanish Inquisition and continuing through the European witch hunts. The idea that witches could make pacts with the devil and perform dark magic was propagated by clerical authorities, making it a moral and religious duty to root them out. A significant turning point came with the publication of Malleus Maleficarum, or The Hammer of Witches, in 1487. Written by two inquisitors, Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, this manual served as the Church's guidebook for identifying and dealing with witches. The text was incredibly influential, setting the stage for widespread witch hunts across Europe. The book claimed that witchcraft was a form of heresy, a threat to Christianity, and something that needed to be eradicated by any means necessary. The witch hunts soon became a political tool. In many cases, accusations of sorcery were tied to land disputes, personal grievances, and efforts to remove unwanted individuals from communities. But the true horror of these hunts lay not in the accusations themselves, but in the torture that followed. The methods of torture. Torture was state-sanctioned and seen as a legitimate tool to extract confessions of witchcraft. The goal was simple: force the accused to confess their alleged crimes, no matter the cost. Those who confessed, often under extreme duress, were executed. Those who didn't, or who retracted their confessions, were subjected to even more brutal methods. One of the most notorious forms of torture was the water test. In this procedure, the accused was tied up and thrown into a body of water, sometimes a river or even a vat. If the individual sank, they were considered innocent, but by that time they were often dead. If they floated, it was believed to be evidence of their unholy connection to the devil. In either case, the accused was doomed. The strappado was another horrifying method where victims were suspended by their arms, often tied behind their backs. The victim was then lifted by a rope and dropped suddenly, causing severe dislocations and extreme pain. The intention was clear: break their body and their spirit, forcing them into submission. Another infamous device was the Iron Maiden, a cage-like structure lined with sharp spikes. The victim was locked inside, where the spikes would impale them as they were slowly crushed in the confined space. This method was not only used on those accused of witchcraft, but also on anyone considered a threat to the church or the state. Perhaps one of the most insidious forms of torture was the sleep deprivation technique. The accused would be deprived of sleep for days, driven to the brink of madness. Unable to think clearly, they were more likely to admit to false confessions, ending their misery, or so they thought. But torture didn't always stop with the accused. Family members and friends of the accused were often dragged into the process as well, with the intent to break the social bonds and extract confessions from anyone who might have knowledge of the sorcery. The role of the Church and the Inquisition. The medieval Church played a significant role in the spread of witchcraft accusations and in organizing the witch hunts. The Inquisition, led by the Catholic Church, operated throughout Europe, targeting those accused of heresy, and witchcraft often fell under this banner. The Church, in its crusade against evil, saw witches as a threat to its authority. The torture was meant to extract confessions not only of witchcraft, but also of blasphemy and heresy, crimes against the Church's sacred doctrines. The inquisitors were notorious for using extreme methods to force confessions from their victims, believing that saving a soul was worth the pain and suffering inflicted upon the body. Accusations were often based on little to no evidence, relying heavily on confessions extracted under duress, testimonies from children, or even simple rumors. The idea was that anyone could be a witch, and the truth was secondary to the perceived need to protect society from evil forces. The medieval witch hunts were not just a chapter in the history of persecution, they were an ongoing nightmare for millions of men and women. As we've seen, the accusations of witchcraft were often based on fear, superstition, and the personal agendas of those in power. The victims of these hunts were often left with little recourse for defense, as the Church, the state, and society stood in unison to condemn them. But as the centuries passed, the witch hunts began to slowly lose their momentum, though the legacy of the horror they caused remained long after the practice died down. The end of the witch hunts, a long overdue reckoning. By the 17th century, public opinion about witch hunts began to shift. This was not because people stopped fearing sorcery, but because the brutality of the witch hunts and the mass executions had started to take a toll on the collective psyche of Europe. Increasingly, intellectuals, scientists, and religious leaders began to challenge the credibility of witch trials. One of the most significant turning points came in 1692, with the infamous Salem witch trials in colonial America, which, while taking place in the New World, reflected the last gasps of medieval witch-hunting ideology. These trials were marked by a sudden wave of accusations, and although the deaths of several individuals during the trials were tragic, they eventually led to widespread public backlash. The authorities and clergy involved in the trials started to feel the pressure of public opinion, and the trials ended soon after, becoming a grim reminder of the destructive power of hysteria. But Europe didn't wait until the late 17th century to begin questioning its methods. Thinkers such as Baruch Spinoza, John Locke, and Voltaire began questioning the moral and intellectual validity of torturing and executing people for alleged crimes like witchcraft. Spinoza, in particular, was vocal about how superstition led to persecution, and that reason must replace it. In Germany, the end of witch hunts began in the early 18th century, with Frederick the Great taking action to outlaw witch trials. By then, the brutality of torture and execution had lost its social acceptance, even in religious circles. The legacy of torture. Psychological and social consequences. Though the witch hunts themselves ended, the psychological and cultural scars they left behind ran deep. The mere fact that torture was considered an acceptable method to extract confessions for something as intangible as witchcraft left a mark on European society. Fear, mistrust, and paranoia continued to pervade daily life. Entire communities turned against each other, and innocent people were made to suffer on the basis of rumors or false accusations. The torture victims often carried physical scars, but the psychological trauma was even more devastating. Victims of the torture had no closure, no peace, and were left with lifelong nightmares. The accusations and subsequent tortures did not just affect those involved directly. They had a ripple effect on families, communities, and even entire regions. A single accusation of witchcraft could cause social ostracization, family breakdowns, and deep-seated fear that lingered long after the trials. The witch hunts created a toxic atmosphere where distrust of one's neighbors became commonplace. Fear of being accused of witchcraft haunted the impoverished women and those who lived on the margins of society, as they were most likely to be targeted. The hunt for witches, after all, was often a hunt for those who didn't fit into the traditional social norms. A return to reason, the modern understanding of witchcraft and justice. As Europe moved into the 18th century, the days of barbaric witch hunts began to fade into history. However, the treatment of accused witches during the Middle Ages left an indelible impact on the way society approached justice. The Enlightenment, with its emphasis on reason, science, and human rights, condemned the cruelty of medieval torture methods. The shifting focus from superstition to science made it clear that accusations based on witchcraft were grounded in nothing more than fear and ignorance. Today, the legacy of these dark times serves as a powerful reminder of the dangers of mass hysteria, ignorance, and unquestioning belief in authority. The horrors of the past forced Europe to rethink its approach to justice, torture, and human rights. Now, in modern legal systems, accusations must be backed by evidence, and methods like torture are considered not only immoral, but unscientific. However, there is a haunting irony in how witchcraft is perceived today. In a world where accusations of sorcery or black magic have diminished, the act of accusing and persecuting has found other forms. While we may no longer torture people for witchcraft, the witch hunt mentality still exists in different forms. From political persecution to racial discrimination to modern-day witch hunts conducted through social media and public opinion. The witch hunts, a warning for today. The lessons of the medieval witch hunts cannot be underestimated. Today we are confronted with a world of accusations, whether in the courtroom, on the internet, or within our communities. History teaches us that without due process, accountability, and a commitment to reason, societies can quickly spiral into chaos. The tortures of the medieval witch hunts remind us of the dangers of placing power in the hands of unaccountable authorities and the devastating consequences of unjust persecution. So, as we look back on these dark chapters of our history, we must ask ourselves, how often do we fall victim to the same traps of fear, ignorance, and suspicion that led to the horrors of the past? The witch hunts may be over, but their legacy of unquestioned fear, injustice, and the abuse of power remains a lesson we can never afford to forget.